Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives. Chapter 2. Forest Green was a quiet, peaceful, boring little town, and Sheriff Michael Garris knew it. What else could you expect from a town named after a goddamn crayon? It was as if they got the name out of a first-grade kid's school box, Garris thought. Sky blue, earth brown, hot pink, and forest green. Now Crystal Lake, that was a name, thought Garris. It conjured up visions of a man in red, hunting plaids, wandering by a lake shore with his Winchester tucked up in the crook of his arm, not much caring if he saw a deer or not, just enjoying the sunlight reflecting off the water and the birds singing in the trees. Maybe he'd settle down by the lake shore and assemble his fishing rod, not really caring whether he caught a fish or not either. The idea was just to kick back against a nice thick tree, light up a pipe, stretch out, and enjoy the peace and quiet. A man could use some peace and quiet after Vietnam. Even after all these years, those memories remained, and that was why he had come here. The name of the town was what had attracted him to begin with, Crystal Lake. The words evoked a pleasant daydream. Forest Green just made him think of O.D. Green, and he had seen enough of Army Olive Drab to last him for a lifetime. Still, he could understand why the town council changed the name. If Forest Green had unpleasant associations for him, the name Crystal Lake reminded the townspeople of something a hell of a lot more unpleasant. But all that was over now. People didn't talk about it anymore. They didn't even want to think about it, which was why they had voted to change the name. It was a quiet town again, a nice town. And even if Garris wished sometimes that he had something more to do than just write an occasional parking ticket or warn some teenage kids about getting a bit too rowdy, he wouldn't trade it for any other place. It was a good place for a man to settle down and raise his kids. Better to write speeding tickets and warn kids to keep it quiet than to have to deal with the violence and frustration of a police job in some big city. A city cop never knew when he might have to pull his piece and shoot someone, and Garris had done enough shooting to last the rest of his life. I can still do it if I have to, he thought to himself, as he leaned back in his office chair and put his feet up on his desk. I've still got what it takes. It's not like I'm getting old. I'm not getting old. Just because a man appreciates some peace and quiet doesn't mean he's getting old, damn it. He frowned. More and more lately, the idea of aging was nagging at him, and he pushed the thought away. He didn't want to think about it. It was just that Megan sometimes made him feel old. She was 18 already. God, where did the time go? It seemed like only yesterday that he was bouncing her on his knee, flushed with the pride of fatherhood, listening to her squeal with delight as he bounced her up and down. She was almost a woman now, cute little body filled out nicely. Too nicely, Garris thought sourly. He wished that Melanie was still alive. He missed her terribly. It was hard trying to raise a teenage girl all by himself. He closed his eyes and sighed. No, Megan was a good girl. A little spirited, perhaps, but hell, you've got to expect that from a teenager. So she gave him a hard time once in a while, talked to him as if he were some old fart. But that was just her way. She was just testing the limits, trying the bounds of his fatherly authority. Kids did that, especially as they got older, right? They pushed you a little and you let them get away with it. A little. But then you slapped them down when they had gone too far, and it reassured them. It let them know that you still cared. He had done his best by her, and considering the way most kids were acting these days, he really had nothing to complain about. Megan knew what was right and what was wrong. Still, sometimes she made him feel a little old. Why did she have to grow up so goddamn fast? He put his head down and started to nod off. Tommy's truck came screeching to a stop outside. Tommy leaped from the truck and slammed the door, then ran across the street at top speed and burst into the county sheriff's office like a man possessed, startling Garris, who was out of his chair like a shot, his gun drawn instantly purely by reflex. Seeing the gun, Tommy came to a dead stop and quickly raised his hands. "Don't shoot, please!" Garris had been scared almost as bad as Tommy, but he couldn't let the kid see that. Just a teenager, he thought. Christ, I'm getting jumpy in my old age. Old age. There was that damn thought again. It made him angry, and he lowered his gun. "You in show business, kid?" he said, annoyed. "You sure know how to make an entrance." Seeing the gun go down galvanized Tommy Jarvis into action, and he rushed toward the sheriff, the words spilling out of him. "You gotta do something! Jason's alive! He killed my friend, and now he's coming after me!" Garris relaxed, but remained cautious. He didn't know this boy, just some hyped-up kid, he thought. Probably knocking off some kind of prank his buddies put him up to. But then again, maybe he was juiced up on something. You could never tell with kids these days. It wouldn't do to have any kind of drug problem in Forest Green. He didn't want Megan mixed up with anything like that. Parents these days had to be extra careful. "Now you better cool out a minute, boy," Garris said, sitting back down, asserting his authority. "You already almost got your head blown to pieces." If this was some kind of screwy kid trying to show off for his buddies by playing a big joke on the law, better let him know right now that this kind of stuff didn't go down in Forest Green, thought Garris. On the other hand, if this kid was high on something, better to cool him out and then pat down his clothes, see what he might have hidden in his vehicle. "Will you listen, damn it?" Tommy shouted at him. Garris stood up. Enough was enough. This kid was going to start showing some respect. "Don't piss me off, Junior, or I will repaint this office with your brains." You had to let these kids know what was what, he thought. He wondered who this boy's parents were. Tommy tried to bring himself under control with visible effort. He hadn't come here to antagonize this man. He had to make him understand. "Jason is alive," he said. "We dug up his body. I was going to cremate it, and—" Garris started to chuckle. So that's what this was all about. Jesus Christ. Kids. Some of 'em will think up the damnedest things. "Hold it. Whoa. What's your name, son?" "Tommy Jarvis. We gotta do something, Sheriff. He's even more powerful now that—" Garris quickly came around his desk. The name had triggered off a memory. "Aren't you the kid whose mother and friends were—" "Yeah," Tommy said, interrupting him, hoping desperately that he was finally getting through to the man. "Jason murdered them, and—" "And you've been at some psychiatric clinic ever since, haven't you?" said Garris, watching his face carefully. Tommy saw what the sheriff was thinking, and he spoke quickly. "Yeah, but they released me because I—" The door banged open suddenly, shocking them both. Tommy almost jumped out of his skin, but it was only the deputy, Rick Cologne, carrying an armload of fast food. He had kicked open the door because his hands were full. He was younger than Garris, in his mid-30s, and he was considerably shorter. He saw the surprise on their faces and grinned apologetically. "Sorry," he said a little sheepishly. "I didn't—" Garris waved him in. "No problem, Rick," he smirked. "Come over and meet a former resident here, Tommy Jarvis. He's got some kind of prank going about." Tommy lost control. "There's no time for this bullshit!" He looked around wildly, panicking, desperate to convince these men that it was not some kind of joke. All of them were in grave danger. His gaze fell on the weapons rack, and without thinking, he bolted toward it and grabbed one of the rifles, pulling it from the rack. "Jason's got to be stopped!" Grabbing for a gun in the presence of two cops was not the smartest thing to do. Cologne dropped the food, and both he and Garris lunged for Tommy, who compounded his mistake by struggling to hold on to the rifle. They wrestled for a moment, and then Cologne pinned Tommy's arms from behind, and Garris yanked the gun away. He was furious. A joke was a joke, and you had to give kids a little leeway, but this was too much. He tried to control his temper as he clenched the rifle in one hand and pointed at Tommy with the other. "Now that's what's known in the books as screwing the pooch," he said, a hard edge to his voice. This kid was going to get taught a lesson right now. He turned to Cologne. "Iron this punk!" There's nothing quite like TV police dialogue to really shake up a kid, Garris thought. Tommy struggled to get away from the deputy, but Cologne held on to him and wrestled him across the floor, throwing him into the holding cell. The iron bars slammed shut. "No!" said Tommy, realizing his mistake too late. "No, please, you've got to listen. Jason's coming back here. He's after me. I tried to destroy him, but I fucked up." "You got that right," Garris said. His temper cooled somewhat, and he realized that perhaps this wasn't something as simple as a juvenile prank. The kid had been in psychiatric clinic for a while, after all. He was clearly disturbed, but that was not at all surprising after what had happened to him. He didn't know why in the hell they had let him out if he was still this disturbed, but they were letting out all kinds of fruitcakes these days, sometimes for no other reason than because their insurance had run out. And why hold on to a welfare case when you can collect the bucks off some other loony's policy? Still, that wasn't his responsibility. His job was to keep the peace in Forest Green, and he wasn't about to have some whacked-out kid running around and upsetting people, much less grabbing guns. "All right, count to 10, he told himself. "Come down on him, but don't come down too hard. The poor kid's had enough of a rough time already." He leaned in toward the cell. "Now you listen up. I'm sorry for what happened to you and your folks years ago. But no one in Forest Green wants to be reminded of what that maniac did here. That's why we changed the name. People want to forget that this was once Crystal Lake, and they don't need some kid stirring up that Jason shit again." Tommy knew that he had gone too far, but he could not calm himself down. They didn't understand, he thought. They just don't know. He started to pace the cell, trying to pull himself together. This was no time to lose his cool. He had done enough damage already. Suddenly, his fury over his inability to get through to them broke loose again. "Why didn't you cremate him?" he said, accusingly, as if it were their fault. Garris tried to keep his patience, but he was rapidly losing it. "They were going to," he said, thinking that if he could humor the kid a little, maybe he could calm him down. One thing he didn't need was some screaming Mimi leaping around like a maniac inside the holding cell all night. "But some asshole sent a lot of money to give Jason and his mother a decent burial. Now look, you just lie down, get some rest. In the morning, I'll call that clinic, and I'll see if they—" Tommy grabbed the bars of the cell as if he could force them apart with his bare hands and get at the sheriff and somehow make him understand. Suddenly he realized that there was a way. "If you just go to the cemetery," he said, "you'll see I'm not lying." Garris had no more patience with him. "Either you go to sleep or I'll come in there and put you out. You understand?" "You're going to be sorry you didn't listen to me," Tommy said defiantly. "You're going to be sorry if you don't shut the fuck up," said Garris. Christ, he thought again. What the hell do they let him out of there for if they're still screwed up? If it wasn't the middle of the goddamn night, he'd drive the kid back over to the clinic himself. All I wanted was a little peace and quiet, he thought. Goddamn kids. With all the rain coming down, the back roads around the town of Forest Green were a quagmire. The headlights of a battered old Volkswagen Beetle bounced up and down as the tiny car jounced along the rutted road, its little engine working overtime. Mud splashed the fenders as it negotiated the wet road. Inside the car, two young people in their mid-20s were slap-happy from their long trip in the late hour. They were lost, and the girl who was driving giggled as her boyfriend did his best to read the spread-out map in the dim light from the single bulb behind the cracked plastic dome-light lens. The car struck a pothole and bounced hard, making the boy's head strike the inside roof. The girl burst into a fresh spasm of giggles. "Will you slow down?" said Darren, giving his girlfriend Elizabeth an irritated look. "It's hard enough to read this thing." Elizabeth bit her lower lip, trying hard not to laugh. "Well, who was it who told me to take this cow path?" "You admit the sign did say Camp Forest Green, with an arrow pointing this way," Darren said. Elizabeth giggled. "I admit nothing without talking to my lawyer." Darren threw down the map in disgust and gave her his impression of Officer Mick Belker's growl. "So much for the head counselors ever finding the camp on their own. I say we stop the car, get out, and start screaming for help." The car came to a halt as Elizabeth hit the brakes. Darren still looking at her sighed. "I was just kidding, Elizabeth." But Elizabeth wasn't laughing. She was staring nervously out through the windshield. Darren turned to see what she was looking at. Standing in the middle of the road, motionless in the glare of the headlights, was a man wearing some kind of crazy mask. A hockey mask of all things. He was holding an iron spear. "Darren, we'd better turn around," said Elizabeth, clearly afraid. "Why?" said Darren. "Why? Because I've seen enough horror movies to know masked weirdos are never friendly," Elizabeth said. She started to back up, but Darren suddenly grabbed the wheel. "Wait!" By reflex, Elizabeth hit the brakes. The car just missed, rolling off the road and into a water-filled ditch. Another few inches, and they'd have backed right into it. Darren looked behind them, then at Elizabeth. "There's no way he can do this," he said. He looked back toward Jason, who was still standing motionless in the middle of the road, blocking their way. "If the car drops into that gully, we'll never get out." Elizabeth couldn't take her eyes off the figure standing in the center of the road. "Do you have any alternate suggestions?" she said, swallowing hard and trying to keep her fear from showing. She wasn't succeeding very well. Darren looked toward Jason and bit his lower lip. "Yeah," he said, "we're gonna scare him." "We're gonna scare him," said Elizabeth, asking. Darren wasn't about to acknowledge the fact that he was also scared. It was the middle of the night. They were lost in a maze of paths and endless woods, on a back road God only knew where, and there was some kind of weirdo just standing there in the center of the road, holding a dangerous-looking spike and wearing a hockey mask, and they were trapped between that character and a gully full of water from the rain. Scared? Yeah, he was plenty scared, but he couldn't let her see that. "That's right," said Darren, trying to pump himself up, to convince himself that he was in control of this spooky situation. "Just drive toward him," he said confidently. "He'll move. Nobody wants to die." "That's a freaking fact," said Elizabeth. "Least of all us." "Just drive," said Darren, trying to sound as if he knew what he was doing. "He'll get out of our way." Elizabeth shook her head, not knowing what else to do, but listened to him. "I'm not really going to do this," she thought. "I'm not really going to try to run some weirdo derelict over in the middle of the road and then just drive off into the night as if nothing had happened." But Darren seemed to know what he was talking about, and what he said seemed to make some sense. The guy would move. He'd have to move. Unless maybe he was drunk, or something like that. Still, drunk or not, there was that nasty-looking spear thing that he was holding, and she didn't think it was a walking stick. She took a deep breath, shifted into first, raced the engine for a moment, and then let out the clutch and stomped down on the accelerator. The little bug leaped forward, chugging toward Jason like a tiny locomotive. He didn't move a muscle. "He's not going to move," thought Elizabeth, terrified of hitting him. Her foot came down hard on the brake pedal. The Volkswagen skidded to a stop on the wet road, its front bumper inches from Jason's legs. The staring eyes behind the white hockey mask drilled them in the glare of the headlights. Elizabeth turned to the suddenly less than confident Darren. "Yeah, that really scared the shit out of him, hon," she said sarcastically, trying to fight down her fear. Darren became angry. He leaned over and blasted the car horn. In reply, Jason swung his spear and smashed out one of the car's headlights. "Oh, jeez," said Darren, shocked by the sudden violence of the reaction. Elizabeth grabbed the gearshift lever. "That's it. We're driving this baby back to town, in reverse." Darren's shock turned to anger at the assault against his car. He grabbed Elizabeth's hand as she started to shift. "The hell we are!" He opened up the little glove compartment and pulled out a small .22 caliber revolver. Elizabeth stared at the gun with disbelief. This wasn't the Darren that she knew. "Where'd you get that?" she said, shocked that he would have a gun, but at the same time feeling suddenly relieved. "Don't worry about it," Darren said, getting out of the car. He was still afraid, but now he had the gun. A spear was no match for a gun. The guy would see that and back off, and that was all he wanted. He had no intention of shooting anybody. "Just stay cool," he told Elizabeth, working up a tough guy tone, trying his best to sound like Eastwood. Quiet, firm, no nonsense, in control. "Stay cool?" said Elizabeth, suddenly alarmed at the prospect of her boyfriend brandishing a gun at someone. What the hell would they do if it went off and killed the guy? The smart thing to do was get back in the car and drive away, now. "You ain't no Dirty Harry. Now stop it!" Darren fought his panic. It's okay, he told himself. I've got the gun. That puts me in control. He held it out before him in both hands, crouching slightly like he'd seen the cops do on TV. He cleared his throat, something no movie or TV hero ever did, but it would spoil the effect if his voice cracked. "All right, scumbag," Darren said, relieved that his voice didn't come out sounding squeaky. "Get out of the road." Jason stood before him, motionless. Darren licked his lips and pulled back the hammer with his thumb, wishing that the sound was louder and more menacing, and that the little gun looked more intimidating. "Now!" he said. Jason's response was to ram his spear into the other headlight. The one remaining light went out, and now he was a dark figure, standing in front of the car, looking even more menacing. Elizabeth screamed. "Darren, get in here right now! He'll kill you!" "Not if I get him first," said Darren loudly. He was the one with the gun, after all. He was going to show this backwoods crazy he meant business. And suddenly, unexpectedly, the dark figure charged him, moving with amazing speed. For a split second, it didn't register. Darren was holding a gun. Nobody charges someone holding a gun. And then he realized what was happening and fired. But it was too late. The bullet either missed or had no effect, and the last thing Darren saw was the iron spear being thrust at him. Elizabeth screamed with hysteria as she saw the spear enter her boyfriend's body. Effortlessly, as if Darren didn't weigh a thing, the killer lifted the impaled body on the spear and tossed it aside into the bushes. It landed with a soft, wet plop, and then the murderous gaze turned on Elizabeth. The girl fumbled for the gear shift lever in a panic, and then saw something coming toward her through the windshield. She lunged across the other seat as the windshield shattered in a rain of glass, and the iron spear rammed into the driver's seat where she had been a split second before. Terrified out of her mind, Elizabeth scrambled out the open door on the passenger side and fell into the gully, dropping down with a loud splash into the muddy water. Jason pulled the spear out of the harpoon Volkswagen and went around the car pursuing the hysterical girl. Elizabeth struggled to get to her feet in the muddy gully, but she slipped and fell back into the water, twisting her ankle. She floundered like a drowning swimmer and looked back over her shoulder. The breath caught in her throat as she saw the killer coming toward her with his spear ready. Trying to run was hopeless. Elizabeth pawed madly through her pockets, desperately trying to think of something with which to barter for her life. Whimpering, she pulled out her wallet, containing all her money for the summer and her credit cards. "Don't kill me, please," she said. You can have these, please." She looked up. The killer had disappeared. She stared into the darkness amazed. What happened? Where did he go? She looked around, but there was no sign of him. She heaved a deep, sobbing sigh of relief. It didn't matter. What was the difference where he went? She was safe. She wasn't going to die. As if dropping from the sky, Jason slammed down into the water beside her. Elizabeth opened her mouth to scream, but the sound never came out. The iron spear came down and plunged right through her open mouth, driving her head back, shattering her teeth, ripping through her throat and vocal cords, crunching through bone. Jason stood over his victim, head bent, staring down at the girl's corpse floating in the filthy water. The head had been driven down into the mud like a butterfly pinned to a board, and blood bubbled up around the spear. The money and the credit cards fell from the lifeless hand, and Jason's gaze followed Elizabeth's American Express card as it floated down the bloody stream. For a moment, but only a moment, the burning rage consuming him subsided. Then the awful hunger flooded through him once again, and the tormenting voice inside his ruined mind began screaming for more blood. No rest. There was never any rest. He had to kill them all, especially the one who had awakened him. Jason looked up from the body and back toward the road. Tommy's pickup truck had gone down that road. Jason began to walk. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 2 of Friday the 13th, Jason Lives by Simon Hawke. I really enjoyed tonight's upload because, again, this is one of my favorite scenes from all the Jason movies, the whole American Express card floating in the water. A lot of people might not get the joke, but in theaters when this was out, a lot of people would yell at the screen, "Don't leave home without it!" whenever they would see that card floating in the water. Anyways, again, very impressed with Simon Hawke's writing style and how he handles these novelizations. I'm looking forward to his other ones, really. And going into Chapter 3, I can tell you right now, a good chunk of the next upload is going to have to do with Jason's psyche and Jason having flashbacks and things like that. I haven't read every word, but I kind of glanced ahead a little bit. And that's going to be really interesting going into Chapter 3. We actually get into Jason's head a little bit. Kind of like we did with Michael in the Halloween novelization we just did recently. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And I think you guys will enjoy that too. Because there's not a lot of books out there. We've done like 14 Jason novels on the channel. All the original ones that weren't based on movies. And none of it really dove into his psyche much. Getting to have flashbacks in the next chapter of Jason remembering things and thinking of his past and his childhood, that's going to be a lot of fun. Let me know in the comments section what you thought of tonight's chapter, and if you're excited about Chapter 3 having to do with Jason's psyche and having flashbacks and memories and stuff from his perspective. Tonight's upload was brought to you by our patrons on the Patreon page: Catherine McClear, Carl Eakin, Sean Campbell, Cecilia Spears in Hawaii. If you would like to support the channel for as low as $2 or $5 per month and help keep the channel going and growing, click that link in the description below and start sponsoring the channel today and get some awesome early content and some great rewards for doing so. Can't monetize the channel here on YouTube due to the copyright holders getting all the ad revenue, so I am depending on the Patreon to keep the channel going and to keep these books getting to churn them out for you here on the channel. Alright guys, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, have a great night, and happy Thanksgiving. I'll be back very soon with more of this great book. See you then.